One of the models I've heard about is I've heard it referred to as like pod homeschooling, where a group of families get together and hire a teacher, which made a lot of sense to me because, like, that's as an adult, one of the ways that I learn is I go to a conference or a talk or a workshop or something for the thing I want to learn about. It almost sounds like the part of the challenge of unschooling is that you have to start consciously thinking about, okay, what do we actually want, as opposed to just defaulting to whatever the dominant culture is suggesting that you have to do. So how is it that you navigate those choices, and then also find all the different options? Because it sounds like, there's groups online, there's social media, there's things like that. Um, but I'm not always sure, like, how to find all of them or which ones are the best, or like how is it that you do you go and try each one out? Do you research online? Like, what's the process of once you of both finding all the options and then evaluating them and deciding which one might be best?
Right. It's such a good question. Let's start with your point about pods. So these pandemic pods or learning pods really came on the scene last July, in July of 2020, as a lot of families were saying, gosh, at that point, their kids hadn't seen other kids in a few months. They were getting increasingly concerned about what the fall would look like in terms of back to school plans. And so they really started as just organic Facebook groups that were started by parents in various geographic areas, saying, hey, looks like the next school year is going to be challenging. How about we get together, with a group of families kind of in a small, safe way to provide some of the social interaction for our kids. And so for a lot of families, they use the pod as a way to make homeschooling more realistic, particularly if parents were still working or working from home. This way they were able to gather with other families and either take turns as parents to facilitate a curriculum or supervise the kids, or pool their resources to hire an educator or a college student or tutors to do that for them. And a lot of families also realized that their districts were going to be remote only for at least the fall semester, in many cases for the entire year. And they said, well, we want our kids to have some interaction with other kids. We don't want them to have a repeat of what they had in the spring, where they were just alone in their homes doing Zoom school. So they got together in these pod groups so that the kids could do district Zoom schooling, but together in a small, safe space, but again, tied to their district. In that case, they, of course, weren't pulling their kids from school for independent homeschooling. They were just doing Zoom school in a small group. And there's been tremendous growth with pandemic pods. Of course, there's sort of this modern twist on time-honored homeschool co-ops that have been around since the beginning of the modern homeschooling movement in the 1970s, but really, I think, have taken off. Another thing that the pods were really able to do is bring to light the microschool movement that was accelerating prior to the pandemic and continues to take off. This would be these microschool networks, similar to what I mentioned about hybrid homeschool models, where you often have these in-home programs with multi-age students. There's a hired teacher or a parent who's trained as a guide who is able to facilitate a curriculum. Often there's proprietary software associated with it that will help to facilitate, in many cases, self-directed education. A lot of the microschools are really focused on kind of these unschooling principles. So we have all of these options, I think, for families. And you're right, sometimes it can be overwhelming. Where do you begin, or how do you find the one that fits you for you? And as much as social media can be a pain sometimes, I think it can be helpful in this instance for connecting families to available homeschooling resources. I mean, for example, when we started homeschooling, Yahoo Groups was sort of the place that everybody went, and that's how we were able to connect with homeschoolers. And those Yahoo Groups has sort of gone by the wayside now, and really it's Facebook groups
I love that
where
we're
you're able
both
to
old enough to
connect.
get that reference. Thank you.
I
I got
know.
taken back in time for a moment.
I know. So I think it's just where it is. I'm sure there'll be, something else in another few years, but often just, searching for your location either your city or state and homeschooling, you'll find resources there. You may find links to grassroots homeschooling organizations or state advocacy groups for homeschoolers in your area that can help link you to some of these social networks or Facebook groups. And the thing that is good about these social media groups is you're often able to wade through a bunch of different groups and see what's being offered. You can look at kind of a broad geographic area. So sometimes, maybe in your immediate area, there's not a good fit, but if you kind of expand your search to Facebook groups that are outside of your kind of local neighborhoods, you might find, other activities or groups that are more suitable for you. You can find, unschooling groups. You can find classical education groups. You can find Montessori homeschoolers or Waldorf homeschoolers or all kinds of different educational approaches and hopefully pick and choose from there.
Someone's going to build an app around this that's location based. That's going to completely change this. I see the opportunity there because you're right. You're right. There's just so many different options, and there's such an important demand for them. One thing I wanted to ask is unschooling around topics that are not academic. So this is one of the things that I was thinking about when looking at your book and the concept of unschooling, which was that a lot of the things that I, as an adult, have got the most benefit from learning were not academic in any way. So things like music or art, people talk about like PE and physical education being removed from schools and the fact that people aren't exercising as much. And like, that's obvious, if you're, so I'm curious how you would approach also adding those non-academic things into your unschooling. Is there a way to do that as well?
Well, the good news is that homeschoolers typically have kind of more of this cultural immersion into their communities than children who go to school. In fact, University of Oklahoma education professor Daniel Hamlin has done research on what he calls cultural capital, and he finds that homeschooling families are twice as likely to go to a library, a cultural event, a concert, a historic site, a bookstore, a museum, a zoo than school children are. So I think some of it is just that, we sort of look at the world as our classroom as homeschoolers, and we're eager to take advantage of all of those amazing resources. And many of these places cater to homeschoolers. They have special homeschool days or special homeschool, weekly classes. They'll have special programming for homeschoolers. And so, it's a great way of really connecting with all of these wonderful resources instead of just a field trip once a year that a schooled kid might go on. So there's that. And I think part of it is also just realizing, not only what you as a family are interested in or the parents are interested in exposing kids to that, but also really being on the lookout for what our children are really passionate about and helping to connect them to resources. And one of the examples I use in the book is my daughter was really interested in taking martial arts classes. A new martial arts studio had opened up near our home, and she thought it was intriguing and went for a trial class and fell in love with it. And so she started taking martial arts classes. And then from there, she became really interested in Korean language and culture. And so at first, I connected her with classes. Online language software Duolingo, which you may know of. It's a free online language learning software. And so she started doing Korean language instruction there, but wanted something more rigorous. And so I was able to find an in-person tutor for her. This was pre-pandemic. It's been over Zoom for the past year. But someone in our city who is a native of South Korea and fluent in Korean, and they've been meeting several times a week now for about 3 years, doing one-on-one Korean language instruction. And I love this example because I think it sort of captures what unschooling really is. It's allowing a child's interests to drive their learning and shows the parent's role of sort of connecting the child with resources, and if one resource isn't enough, to figure out what else might be available for them. And then also gets to the idea that sometimes parents will say, well, I don't know calculus. How could I ever teach my kids calculus? And I said, well, I don't know Korean,
Right.
but this is how it works. And I think it's another, just sort of good example of leveraging the resources around us, many of which are free or low cost to facilitate our child's education.
How is it that you discover your child's interests or expose them to things that will allow them to figure out what they like? So you mentioned that your daughter passed a martial arts studio and got curious about it, and then that led to an interest in Korean. How is it that you sort of notice that and then also give them the opportunity to have that initial spark?
I think it's a lot like how we as adults learn and discover new things too. It comes from being exposed to different experiences, engaging with other people in our community, friends and neighbors and other community members to see what's possible and what you're interested in. My older son is a big skateboarder, and so it became very clear early on that that was a passion of his. And then we were able to connect with other, skateboarders in our local area. And now he has a wonderful group. Actually, many of them homeschool. In fact, many of them decided to pull their kids out during the pandemic and are not planning on going back now that they've discovered kind of this great skateboarding homeschooling community there. So, I think some of it's watching what your kids naturally like, and the other part of it is just exposing them to as many varied experiences and opportunities as possible.
Thank you for listening. If you like this clip, please subscribe and share the show with someone else who would also like it. You can find the Brendon Marotta Show on all major podcast platforms and at brendonmarotta.com/show. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to share more with you in the future.